Hello everyone, I'm back! Today I want to talk about a concept that I call neo-nordicism. I also want to talk about right-wing nutjobs on YouTube and the mainstream media. But more importantly, I want to talk about Sweden. A land where idiots think that roving gangs are taking over the streets, changing the North as we know it, and crumbling Western civilization. Now, the things I mention in this video can be applied to a lot of different Nordic countries, but I live in one of them, so that's the one I'm going to talk about. I also think Sweden is the one people talk about the most when talking about the Nordic countries, but that's not always the case, and I don't want to make too wild generalizations. I'm going to talk about Sweden, because I'm Swedish, and a lot of right-wing morons on YouTube are also Swedish. And they can't just be there alone. So let's talk about Nordicist for a bit. Nordicist is a fairly old racist ideology that belongs in the genre of racial supremacy. The ideology of Nordicist describes that people belong to certain races, and that certain races exist in hierarchical relationship to each other. And as you can probably tell from the name, the Nordic race is usually seen as being on top. And I know you've heard of this before, because this was a pretty significant bit of, the Nazis, despite being much older than the concept of Nazism itself. Nordicism has its origin in the 19th century during the creation of the idea of the Aryan race, with its various branches. Its principal proponent was Arthur de Goblin in his essay on the inequality of the human races, who argued that while the Nordic people weren't directly Aryans, they were the best modern representative of the Aryans, which in turn influenced Nazi ideology of a master race, which was either Nordic or Nordic in heritage. This is also the reason why Northern paganism has been appropriated by Nordicists as a symbol of their supposed Nordic superiority. The core concept in Nordicism is that a specific race is or should be dominant to other races, or at the very least, be an idealized version of itself. Or at the very least, remain superior over other races. In the case of specifically Nordicism, the race is obvious, the Nordic race. But as I said, ideologies adapt, and as such, Nordicism has adapted itself into the local white population. In the Anglosphere, it's more commonly known as Anglo-Saxonism. In Germany, Teutonism. Nordicism describes that the target demographic belongs to a common tribe, older and more ancient than current political divisions, and that this tribe has certain physical characteristics that make that tribe inherently superior to others. In this way, it's highly related to nationalism, however, somehow even more racist. And many nationalists are also Nordicists. Now, I don't think I have to tell you this, but this is old-timey, really bad racism. And I can already hear you say in the comments, but what about today? Racism that bad hasn't existed since the 50s. Arguably, Nordicism has existed in the modern Western zeitgeist for years, up to the modern day. And I say arguably because that is what I'm arguing, that is what I'm saying in this video. And this connects to Sweden, I promise it does. I'm not totally bullshitting. This connects to Sweden, just bear with me. Like most things neo, it's a thing that has adapted to the modern times and changed from what it used to be before. Hence the neo part. This is because today you can't be as flat out racist as you could be in 1940, although many people are trying to bring that back into fashion. Today, however, there is a much larger focus on whiteness and white culture, and of course, white genocide. This has sometimes been described as a new concept, and it's not totally without fault. Not too long ago, people who would today be described as white would have been heavily racially discriminated against. Some people have described why this has happened, and while there are many explanations to it, this simple answer is that Nordicism has simply expanded and adapted once more. You can't be as flat out open with your racism anymore, so you have to generalize. You have to generalize your ideology to remain popular. The idea of whiteness is only a concept that is a subset of Nordicism that has adapted to the modern times. It's nothing really new, it's merely a broader generalization of a much older ideology. And because of the loss in popularity, people who do believe in this old-timey flat-out racism have been forced to, ironically, diversify. The ideology of Nordicism is forced to generalize, to bring in people who could arguably be close to the racial purity of Nordicism, or at least close enough to suit the interest of the core Nordicists. But remember, the core ideology still remains the same. The idea is that there is one type of people who are superior to another, and as long as that core tenet can be maintained, Nordicism is, at least to its followers, coherent. And because Nordicism is forced to rely on fantastical versions of the past, this generalization creates an historical inaccuracy, more than the obvious ones, obviously. This is why right-wing nutjobs have a hard time believing that, for example, the Irish weren't considered equal to the English, because today their narrative would require that all white people belong to the same common tribe, while this is definitely not the historical case. This is because they rely on the narrative of ancient tribalism, while in fact this ancient tribalism has at best only tangibly existed. This is why it's extremely common to see historical falsehoods from the extreme right, talking about white identity and white culture. Those concepts are historically extremely new. The concept of white today does not have the same intonation as white did 100 years ago. The concept of white is in itself a fairly new concept. But these are only new words, new tools to be used in the goal of racial superiority. And this is, of course, extremely common within right-wing extremist groups. During the height of fascism in Italy and Germany, Nordicism was also very much generalized. Although not as generalized as whiteness as a concept today, Mussolini himself claimed that Italians were racially superior due to Nordic heritage. This is extremely reminiscent of rhetoric used by the far right today. Replace white identity with Nordic identity, and you hear very similar arguments today as you did in 1940. Within this is also the creation of the ideal type of person that you can become. Because of the generalization, this has become less racial and more cultural, although the racial intonations are still extremely much there. And this kind of generalization has been going on ever since the World War, and today that concept is still very much alive. It might seem contradictory that an ideology based on specific racial superiority would generalize itself, but it's important to remember that the ultimate goal is not only the creation of the ideal society, it is the total destruction of everyone who do not fit into that society. At the same time, this type of rhetoric is used to drum up support and to create a power base for other adjacent goals. Nordicism is not always the goal itself, but sometimes the method by which to attain power and influence within extreme right circles. A very typical example of this is the Swedish resistance movement, who have now been forced to generalize into the Nordic resistance movement due to lack of popular support. And the lack of popular support is common. Many extreme right factions are fringe, and they should be. However, there is a method for the far right to circumvent this, to use Nordicism to gain power, and that is conflict. The ideology of Nordicism requires constant conflict. The conflict is used to explain fallacies within the ideology or the theory behind the movement itself. If something doesn't line up with your expectations, well, it's the enemy's fault, the other ones who are not racially superior. If we're talking about potential racial superiority, this racial superiority has to be under threat from a generic type of enemy that justifies the violence and the conflict that comes with it. And not just an enemy to the state, or laws, or border, an enemy to the race itself. And this takes a lot of different forms, not just within the extreme right. In extreme forms, this rhetoric might express itself by talking about potential direct attack from this enemy that would replace you and eliminate you and your kind from the earth. In milder forms, it can take the form of the argument that we can't let in immigrants in a country because that would make the country poorer. But I hear you. What the fuck does this have to do with Sweden? The reason I want to talk about Nordicist and Sweden specifically is because Sweden keeps popping up in online discussions about socialism or feminism or any type of progressive cause, or, more commonly, immigration.
Of arrivals from Muslim countries, perhaps no nation on earth is more committed to accepting foreign migrants and refugees than Sweden.
Sweden is often seen as this place where progressive causes have gone too far, have stepped over the line, started infringing the rights of their own citizens for the benefit of others. And you can already see the connection to Nordicism. And Sweden does have elements of progressive causes, not to the point of feminist dictatorship, but Sweden is arguably one of the more progressive countries on the earth. We had a feminist government, for God's sakes. Because of this, Sweden often becomes this target whenever people want to attack these specific progressive causes. However, for that to work, you need two things. One, these ideas have to exist in the extreme, and two, these ideas have to not work. And or lead to the collapse of Western civilization, whatever works. Obviously, Sweden hasn't collapsed. But for this type of discrediting to work, people usually have to argue against the straw man of Sweden.
Sweden is so politically correct. One of its leading cultural journalists says Swedes don't deserve their own national day and that, quote, nationalism should be wiped out.
It requires Sweden to be in decline. This is why news about Sweden are often taken out of context or exaggerated or sometimes just straight up lied about. The conflict we mentioned earlier as part of Nordicism to explain away its own fallacies exists here too. The alleged conflict in Sweden is fabricated for this same reason. It exists to explain away the fallacies and cognitive dissonance that would otherwise be obvious when people who are against progressive causes use Sweden as an example as to why these progressive causes don't work, when in fact they do. Sweden has taken in more refugees per capita than a lot of other countries. We have a fair bit of socialism and we have a strong feminist movement, and things are going pretty good. And if you belong to the extreme right and you don't like progressive causes, then Sweden should, if your ideas were correct, collapse. And this is what people are arguing is happening. If you are against the concept of progressive ideas, Sweden should be an example as to why you are wrong. However, you can't admit defeat, and therefore Sweden is collapsing anyway, no matter what the facts say. And it just so happens that a lot of people who prescribe to Nordicist ideas are also against progressive causes. And this is all part of the idea of conflict within Nordicism. Within groups of Nordicists, progressive causes and non-white people have been portrayed to be the enemy that exists in this conflict. And because of this, Sweden, or rather the Nordicist idea of Sweden, becomes a battleground of this ideology. If you were to ask a Swede 100 years ago what does the stereotypical Swede look like, he would probably say like this. You may not like it, but that is what peak Sweden looks like. Sweden fits neatly into the idea of Nordicism. It's easy to see why people would call us Nordic. This combined with the fact that Sweden has historically always been at the center of ideological debates leads Sweden to become the perfect mesh point. Sweden, by sheer geographical location, is a place that many Nordicists would probably see as a place to defend Nordic culture, or as they say now, white culture. And this is not a new thing. Historically, Sweden has always existed in the middle ground between ideologies. We were neutral during both world wars and during the Cold War. As the rest of the world chose capitalism or communism, Sweden chose the Swedish third way, not to be confused with the other third way, which is, fascism, or at least what people called fascism before they realized fascism is just right wing. And because Nordicism hasn't really gone away, but merely adapted itself into anti-progressive white culture identity politics, a new ideal has to be created too. And again, Sweden fits neatly into the idea of Nordicist ideals. The idea that Swedes are blonde, blue-eyed bimbos with big boobs wasn't created in this Nordicist conflict, but it was reinforced, because that ideal is used as justification to be against any kind of progressive idea. And more importantly, because the historical status quo does not line up with the Nordicist ideal, which they claim is the historical status quo, the ideal is arguably constantly under threat, by just virtue of existing. And in order to keep the narrative going, both sides of the Nordicist conflict have to be constantly built upon. And this conflict is sometimes seen as the default, which only feeds the cycle of scaremongering. And this is true even in cases where concern is warranted by good people. Now, if you ever watched a single YouTube video, you've probably been recommended a lot of Nazis to watch. And some of these Nazis talk a lot about how Sweden is constantly collapsing. They keep cropping up over and over and over again. And this keeps happening not just in fringe media like YouTube, but also in the mainstream. This is where the conflict becomes the most obvious. And these kind of videos and articles have been ongoing for decades now, which leads me to the question, when the fuck is the country gonna collapse already? Time. Now, Sweden isn't perfect. Like, we have a lot of troubles, but it's not collapsing. Sweden's going pretty okay according to, most facts. It doesn't matter if you feel that Sweden is falling apart or not. All the facts say that it isn't. Sweden isn't really falling apart, at least not from the causes that right-wing morons on YouTube and on Fox News say it is. For example, I've yet to see a long-form video about why the democratic institutions that power most of the liberal West has inherent flaws within it that will eventually lead to the takeover of market capitalism over the power of elected representatives. That's not something you see a lot of. Where's the video on that? Huh? No, they just keep complaining about Muslims and socialism over and over and over again. Sweden has far more serious issues than what Nordicists could ever even hope to think of. And that is why Nordicism and all right-wing ideologies that heavily rely on it don't really have ideologies at all. Only the aesthetic and appearance of ideology. Fascism doesn't really have an established ideology. It only looks as if it does, and it only pretends that it does. The funny thing is that this scaremongering about too progressive Sweden has been going on for decades.
See the floating sex lab, a moonlit cruise where 15-year-old girls learn the practical side of sex. See the roving motorcycle bands, preying on innocent young girls whenever and wherever they find them. You owe it to all your senses to see Sweden, heaven and hell.
Sweden and other Nordic countries are only stand-ins for the fantastical ideal that right-wing morons try to use as an answer when they get the question, who are you trying to protect anyway? The truth is that Sweden is a pretty bland country. Not much is happening here. And because this narrative has become so mainstream, I think it's important to note also that Sweden isn't that right-wing dominated as many mainstream news shows would have you believe. Most coverage about the Swedish election was dominated about reporting of the Sweden Democrats, who are extremely anti-immigration and extremely far-right. This is despite fairly low election results. And this is dangerous because it gives the viewer the idea that Swedes care more about Nordicist ideals than they actually do, which is, judging by the election result, not that much. During the recent election, there was more reporting about the possibility of a right-wing extremist takeover rather than the real danger that has happened. No government at all, which is arguably more dangerous, but also more boring. Sweden becomes a pawn in mostly American discussions about ideology that doesn't really have anything to do with Sweden in the first place. The point of this video isn't just to ramble on about how racists keep talking about Sweden. It's more to show that racism today is not just the continuation of an ancient bias that humanity keeps having over and over again. The racism we have today is intentional, and it's adapting, it's currently improvising itself. It's not chaotic or unintentional, it is very intentional and it's very guided. I get the feeling sometimes that people see racism as a kind of ancient idea and not something that is current and that is currently evolving and adapting. But what I wanted to talk about is more how modern racism adapts to the current times in order to remain popular. The old Nordicist idea is currently seen as outdated, but the neo-Nordicist idea of whiteness is gaining traction. It's also to highlight that the current idea of whiteness isn't as new as many people sometimes think. It has merely generalized itself in order to remain relevant and to sustain itself. I think that a lot of white people especially sometimes see racism as chaotic and unintentional and old, whereas modern racism is new. It is adapting, and it is very much intentional. Racism doesn't survive only by demonizing the other. It also sustains itself by creating an ideal that is most often fantastical. And this is one of the reasons why Sweden and other Nordic countries keep popping up in discussions about immigration and any kind of progressive argument. And Sweden probably profits from this. Sweden is more relevant in international news than many other countries of similar population and economy. Many people on the right will keep seeing Sweden as being in constant collapse every single day. I also think that Sweden will keep being a battleground for this. I don't see a situation where Sweden will somehow stop becoming relevant because it's such an established talking point whenever these kinds of issues come up. And I'm not saying that Sweden comes up every time. I'm saying that Sweden comes up unproportional to how important Sweden actually is. And it's not that important. I'm sure that right-wing morons will keep talking about how Sweden is going to collapse, despite the fact that it's all just ideological arguments in a discussion that really has nothing to do with us. Thank you for watching this video. If you like my content and would like to see more of it, I'd suggest that you should click the subscribe button at the bottom of the video. You can also support me on Patreon for some nice perks, or just for the joy of supporting me creating videos like this for the future. I also want to thank Ibrahim, Kim and Emma for being supporters on Patreon. Thank you so much. You allow me to have food and pay rent. Thank you.